Joanne this evening. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. All right. Let's get that up there. All right, so as Charlotte mentioned, I work for the National Park Service as an urban ecologist, and specifically I work on the Bobcat project. And so today I was just gonna talk a bit about working on the Bobcat project, what it's like being an urban ecologist, and what we've learned about bobcats working with them for over the last 25 years. So one of the most common things that I actually hear when I tell people what I do is they're like, you do what? Where? You do that next to Los Angeles? As many of you know, even though we live next to this large mega city of Los Angeles, we still have tremendous natural resources in the area. And as good stewards of these natural resources, we want to make sure that they persist into the coming generations, and so that everyone is able to appreciate them and these populations can persist in this area. However, in addition to the fact that we live next to this mega city, it's also not this super clean border between the city and the natural areas, as many of you know. And one of the things that we all love and enjoy is that we've got this really complex interlocking network of the urbanization and natural areas coming right up to our back doors. And this is really nice for residents and homeowners, but it can cause a pretty challenging landscape for wildlife to persist in. And so that's one of the things we study, is how these animals are persisting in this remaining natural habitat and how they're navigating the landscape around the urbanization. In addition to the actual urban structures of buildings and cement and roadways, we also have these other types of landscapes around, such as city parks and golf courses and cemeteries. And they don't present urbanization the same way the buildings and roads do, but they're also not completely natural. And so we refer to these as altered open space. And we're also very interested in how these sorts of landscapes also play a role in the persistence of wildlife populations in the area. So as being a wildlife biologist in an urban megacity, one of the things that we've learned to do is coexist. So one day we might be out here working in this beautiful, pristine, lovely habitat, looking at these gorgeous views, and another day we might be working next to the city, or as is going on in this photo, we were actually enjoying some hospitality of a resident as we were waiting for a female bobcat to leave her den site so that we could go in and count her kittens. So as we do this as biologists, the wildlife has also learned to coexist. They live in the natural spaces right behind our houses. They live in our backyards. They live all around us. They do often prefer the natural habitat, but they'll come right next to our houses. And all of these photos were sent to us from homeowners themselves. So most of you are pretty familiar, I think, with where we work, but I'll go over it briefly here. So we've got the geological Santa Monica Mountains to the south of the 101, and to the north of the 101s, the Simi Hills and Santa Susana Mountains. And although we are the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, you know, the wildlife obviously doesn't obey the recreation borders. So we do work all over this region to see how these animals are persisting throughout the region. And for the bobcats specifically, we're really interested in this area close to the 101, just to the north and south around Liberty Canyon and up into Thousand Oaks area. If you're familiar with this area, you'll know that there's these large patches of remaining natural habitat surrounded by urbanization and roadways. And although these are large and bobcats can definitely use them, often they represent an area that's smaller than a home range for a bobcat. So they might have to link several of these together in order to persist in the area. So just briefly give you, Charlotte went over this a little bit, but give you a little background to our study. So it has been going on for 25 years, longest running bobcat study that we know of. It started before the turn of the century in 1996. And it is focused on the urban fragments and the surrounding core and parkland, and particularly the roadway corridors. We're really interested in the role that roads play as far as limiting movement of these animals and also potentially as a source of mortality. And over this time, we've captured and marked over 377 individuals and followed over 200 of them with telemetry. So how are we studying these carnivores? Well, as I mentioned, we have captured a lot, and that is still the primary way that we learn the most information is by following individual animals, which means capturing them, tagging them, putting a telemetry collar on them, and then we get to learn from them what they need in this environment, how much space they need, how they can move around through the landscape, and very importantly, how well they survive, and if they don't survive, what sorts of mortality are we seeing out there. But in addition to tracking, we have other tools that give us a lot of additional information, such as using remote cameras. That's a huge one these days. We have a ton of cameras out in the field. And then also some old school methods of just looking for tracks and signs of animals. So we actually have a scat project where we go out monthly and look for scat. And I'll get into details on some of these methods here in just a second. So we'll start with the trapping the bobcats. So in order to follow them with telemetry, put a collar on them, we do at first have to trap them. And so we will set up these traps in the natural environment where we know that the bobcats like to roam, and we monitor these traps extremely closely when they're out. So we actually physically go to the traps every single day and check them. And then we also use remote techniques for monitoring the traps when we're not there so that we know if we've captured something. So typically every day when we go to the traps, generally this is what we find. It does take a really long time to capture these animals. Sometimes we have to be really patient. So most of the time we're going and checking empty traps in the morning. And occasionally in that we'll get things like this. So it's just a raccoon. We do catch a fair number of non-targets. We just let them go and they're fine. Occasionally we'll catch guys like this. This guy, we get hawks in here even. He was a little freaked out when I walked up to him, but as soon as I opened the door, he hopped off happily. And then the other thing that we find occasionally while we're out there trapping are things like this. This is actually right near one of my trap sites. And this is just another additional thing that we have to be aware of while we're working in an urban area is that there's a lot of people around and a lot of people doing strange things sometimes. And so we're constantly looking for signs of people to try to keep our traps away from people. We don't want people or animals getting hurt if people don't know what's going on with the traps. And then one of the additional bits that we've been one of the additional bits of technology that we've been able to add lately to our trapping is actually using wireless remote cameras. So this camera is actually attached to the back of the trap and is looking into the trap and is sending wireless photos on motion. So if it's triggered by motion, it'll send a photo to my phone. And so I can sit at home at night and bite my fingernails and see if we've caught anything in the traps. And I get an alert every time we get a photo. So I'm sitting on the couch at night and every time I hear my phone beeping, I'm feverishly looking at it. Although often this is what I'm seeing is just some mice or some birds or other things. But eventually we will see this and we will capture an animal. Occasionally I'll also see that where we see someone who decided not to fall for our tricks and moved on for the evening, but hopefully eventually they'll circle back around. So eventually it does work and we capture these guys in the traps, and then we will, when we get to them, we make sure they're covered and feel as secure as possible, and then we will use a drug to anesthetize them for handling. So this is a workup here. So when we do have the animals in hand, we like to make sure we're getting all the possible information we can possibly get. So our primary reason for capturing these animals is to place a collar on them so that we can track them. But there's all sorts of additional information that we can actually get from handling these animals. So we're taking blood samples, we're taking hair samples, we're taking all sorts of measurements. We're measuring teeth and ears and feet and chest. We're taking samples like urine and feces, just everything we can possibly take and learn as much as we can from every single one of these captures that we get. So once we have placed a collar on an animal, then we go about learning from them and tracking them. And so there's basically two types of technology each of these collars use. There's VHF radio telemetry, or a radio signal that the collars give off. And this is kind of the old school technology that's been around for a really long time. People started tracking animals in like the 70s with this type of technology, and we still use it on every single collar that we put out nowadays. And basically all it is the collar gives off a unique signal on a unique radio frequency that we can use special equipment to pick up that signal. So this is a special receiver that we have here with an antenna, and we can hear the radio signal being given off by the animal's collar with this. But the only information that that gives us is a direction in which the animal is coming from. So if you're out in the field, you can hear this signal, you get a direction to the animal, but to actually get any information on where that animal is, you have to move to additional locations and triangulate that location. This technology is still used because it allows us to get a real-time location on the animal. We can go out and see exactly where that animal is right then and there in that moment if we need to. However, what we also use in addition to that now is GPS technology. Same as your phone or your car, these collars are capable of using the GPS satellite system, and they will take points on a predetermined schedule that we make. And they'll acquire that data and store it in the collar, and then they'll upload it through either a different satellite system, or sometimes we use collars that will actually utilize the GSM networking message system, so sending text messages essentially to us. But one way or another, we're able to actually get all of those locations downloaded to a server, which we can access from our computers sitting in the office or nowadays sitting at home. So this is just an example of what that data looks like. So we're getting these points of where this animal is. And this technology is great because obviously it's a lot less labor intensive. We get lots of data while we're just sitting at home. And it's also very accurate. The GPS points can be really accurate. So it gives us a large amount of data, but it does have some drawbacks. It is more prone to failing, and also we don't get real-time data. So no matter how frequent we're scheduling these collars to take points, you're not getting them the moment they're being taken. There's always going to be some delay. And with the bobcats being such a small animal, and the batteries can only be so big on these collars, we can actually only set them to take a couple points a day, or we'd kill the battery immediately. So So we're just not getting that real-time information. And that's why we keep that old school technology on the collars of that radio signal, so we can go out and get that real-time information if we still want it. This just gives you an example here of the kind of information that we're getting. So each time the caller takes a GPS point, or every time we go out and triangulate it in the field with the radio telemetry, we essentially just get a point of where that animal is. But then we can take all of those points together and build a home range of where that animal lives. We can also get additional information such as a core area, so we can learn where the animal spends most of its time, even though it might have a wider range where it roams. And we can learn about movement patterns, what day they're moving more, what time of day they might be moving to certain areas or crossing things such as roads, and just generally how they're using the landscape. So another thing that we can do from following individual animals, or more specifically following individual females, is we can document reproduction. So by following the females intensely in the springtime, which is when the bobcats in this area give birth, we can identify den use. And essentially we do that, we'll either use that radio technology and track them 4 to 5 times a week, or just monitor their GPS super closely. And we watch for them to stay at a site. For about the first week they're in a den, they'll stay at that site pretty much the entire time. They won't leave the den at all. And then after about a week, they'll start making short trips away, but they'll continually return to this exact location over and over again. And this is not a behavior that they do any other time of year, and it's not something the males do. They're generally just always on the move all around their home range. And so when we see this behavior, we know that they have likely inhabited a den, and we can then either use the GPS points if they're nice and accurate, or sometimes we'll have to use the VHF signal to hone in on the female in order to find her den site. And show you here an example of some of the dens. So this is just a hollowed area underneath the brush. Essentially, a lot of the den sites actually don't have any specific structure here. They just tend to be in the thickest of the brush that they can get in, and then they'll kind of hollow out an area under that. Sometimes they will use wood rat nests. They'll likely evict the wood rats from the nest and inhabit their nest while they're kittens. And just to give you an idea of how difficult it can be to find these dens. So this one is actually got a little person right there standing. That's at a den site. You can barely see them, but that's, you know, they're standing up there. So that's how tall the brush is. So it's nice and thick and tall. And, you know, imagine little bitty kittens in that nice, thick, tall brush. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, even when you have GPS points and you can go in closely. We don't always find the dens. Sometimes we know that we're extremely close and we still never can find them because they're just that well hidden. And so, as you might imagine, being in this urban area, there are urban dens. It's actually pretty rare. They generally do tend to den in the natural habitat. Even if they have fair amounts of urbanization in their home range, they'll still generally den in the natural area. But occasionally we'll see them in the urban area. So we have a female here that denned underneath the house. That was an interesting one. We actually did go crawling underneath the house to find the kittens and count them. And this one was in the wall next to a house. We've also had one in a backyard, as I showed you earlier when we were waiting to go into that female's den. So it happens occasionally. And then once we do find the kittens, we do a similar workup with them that we do with the adults. Although if we're not going to be attaching any kind of radio transmitter to them, which we don't these days, we aren't anesthetizing them, so we're just working them up awake. But we do the same thing. We do measurements and we place ear tags, and we just generally look them over to make sure they're healthy, and take samples. So we record all 340 here wasn't really too interested in what we were doing. He's kind of fighting back a little bit. Just a side note here, looking at this photo, working side by side with one of my volunteers. The volunteers are absolutely instrumental in this project. I just want to give them a quick shout out. None of these projects would be possible without my interns. They're all amazing and awesome. And Santa Monica Mountains Fund is actually the one that supports them. So having that support is what really allows us to do these projects and accomplish all that we're able to accomplish. So we did for a while actually also track the kittens through telemetry, but in order to do that, as you can imagine, we can't actually put a collar on these animals because they're small and they're growing rapidly. And so they would outgrow a collar immediately and it wouldn't be safe for them. So in order to track the kittens, we use an implantable radio transmitter. So this is a little more invasive of a procedure, especially in the beginning. After the implant is in, it's actually much better for the animals because they don't know it's there and it can't get caught on anything. And so it's actually better. But we did feel like we had enough information on kitten survival and dispersal. And so for now, we've stopped doing this. We're just marking the kittens. We may return to tracking them again someday if we feel like things have changed in the population and we'd like to learn some more. So just to give you a quick rundown, these numbers are a little dated, mostly because we haven't actually seen a lot of reproduction in recent years, and I'll go over kind of why that is. But our numbers for from 1997 to 2015, we followed 58 individual females over that time through 14 breeding seasons, and we documented 56 events of reproduction. Sometimes that was the same female giving birth year after year. And on any given year, the average rate of reproduction was about 50%, meaning about half of the females would give birth that year. And we marked 79 kittens from 34 different litters, and our average litter size is about 2.3 kittens. All right, so moving on to some other tools that we use for studying this population. Remote cameras, as I mentioned, those are huge now. We use so many cameras and they're amazing and they're awesome because we get a lot of great data from these and they're totally not invasive to the animals at all. They are very labor intensive, more than you might think, because we literally get tens of thousands of photos that need to be gone through. We are actually in the process of trying to look for better solutions for going through these photos, including potentially using either crowdsourcing. We have actually people going through our photos for us, or using AI, artificial intelligence, to automatically go through the photos. So, but there's all sorts of information that we can get from using cameras. Chiefly, we just get presence or absence, so we know if these animals are in a specific location or not. We can also use them to monitor specific corridors, like this is a crossing under the 126 freeway. So we know that this cat in particular, we saw this same cat go back and forth. He had learned that this was a good way to cross the roadway safely, and so he would just go back and forth in this same little culvert over and over again. And we can also get a little bit of information about behavior. And so this is over a 6-month period of time. It was right before the Woolsey fire. Unfortunately, this spot, which happened to be this cat's favorite hunting ground, it looks like, burnt in the Woolsey fire, so we didn't see him there anymore. But this is 5 different incidences, 5 different total times where he's obviously doing the same exact thing. So we figured out where he likes to go and hunt rabbits. Oh, and then the other thing I will mention with these photos too, is you can see there's actually a camera. You can see in the photos a second camera. So this project that we're doing, for the bobcats, we're actually using 2 cameras so that we can identify individuals that we don't have marked. So you can identify bobcats by their spot patterns. And by using 2 cameras, we try to get both sides of the animal all the time so that we can identify these individuals just looking at the photos. And then occasionally we will get some other things with our cameras. Sometimes learn about other things venturing into the natural open space. This poor puppy was on one of our cameras, and he was there for an hour or so with this bucket on his head, unfortunately, and wandering around and kept bumping into everything in the area. He did eventually get the bucket off of his head and took off, so that was good. Not sure what he was doing here though. And then this photo, you can see this was the Woolsey fire, and we had in this particular project for the bobcats, we lost most of our cameras in the fire, and then we did get some interesting photos of the fire, but we also got to watch our cameras burn in the photos since we have the dual cameras. And SAMO Fund was great. They helped us replace all these cameras immediately and get this project back up and running right away so we could see the difference in the use of the landscape right before the Woolsey fire and right after. And then, as I mentioned, we still use some of these old school techniques, just out looking for signs. So we have a scat line project for the bobcats as well, where we walk specific transects once a month looking for scats, or if you're not familiar with what that is, it's poop. So we count so we can get relative numbers of how many bobcats are in that area. And then for a while, we were also actually collecting these scats and using them to analyze diet. And then this is also a scat project, and it's correlated with the Bobcat project, but this is a class that I take out, and we actually do rabbit pellet plats. So rabbits are a really important prey item for bobcats, which I'll show you in a few minutes here. But so we can actually use rabbit scat to determine relative rabbit numbers in the same areas that we're doing it with bobcats, so we can get comparisons. And as I mentioned, this was actually a class that I take out every spring, and they do these rabbit pellet plots for me. And we've been doing this project for about, I think, 10 years now. So we've gotten a lot of information. So this is what the kind of numbers that we're getting for our scat counts. And on this particular graph, I've also got mange deaths graphed, but we'll ignore that for now. We'll just look at the scats. So every month we get a scat count, and then we can average those over the months, and we can get relative numbers and see how the population is changing throughout time. And as you can see, we were initially getting a lot more, picking up a lot more scats, and then in 2003 and 2004, those numbers really went down, and we'll return to that. So from collecting the scats, we can analyze them and see what these animals are eating. And what we've learned from the bobcat scats is that rabbits are extremely important in their diet. So that's why I mentioned we are doing the rabbit pellet counts. And then wood rats and pocket gophers, you can see, are also quite important. So one of the last things that we're interested in with the bobcat population is survival and mortality. And so this is one of my least favorite parts of my job, is having to pick up the animals when they're dead. But it's extremely important, obviously. We learn a lot of information from picking these animals up and figuring out what they died from. And so in order to do that, we do a necropsy. We actually have a brand new lab facility at La Crête, or Rocky Oaks, if you're familiar with that area. One of the areas that one of our buildings burned, but fortunately our branding lab did not burn in the Woolsey fire. We had literally just gotten the keys like the month before the fire, so I was very happy that it didn't burn. So we're able to do necropsies on these animals though and figure out what they are dying from. And so what we have learned was, as you saw in the graph, there's a lot larger population before 2002, and survival was very high before 2002, greater than 70% annual survival rate. But in recent years, the annual survival rate has been as low as 0%, meaning for the animals that we have on the air, the animals that we're following, none of them have survived through the year. That doesn't mean every single bobcat died that year, just the ones we were following. So, but the leading cause of mortality we found is mange disease, and the second leading cause of mortality is being struck by a vehicle. So mange disease, if you're not familiar, is actually a mite. It's a microscopic mite that burrows into the skin, and it causes all sorts of skin lesions and hair loss and extreme itching, and actually can lead to death eventually when it gets to be a severe enough case. And we believe that the mange is related to anticoagulant exposure. This is something we've been studying for a long time now. And we have pretty good data to show that there is a correlation. Anticoagulants, if you're not familiar with those are just the rodent poisons that are put out to control small mammal populations. And we believe the carnivores get it secondarily. So the animals that are being targeted are the small mammals, and then the carnivores are eating the small mammals once they've been exposed, and they are also being exposed to the anticoagulant. And what we've learned is that exposure in general is really high in the bobcats. So greater than 90% of the animals that we test, of the bobcats that we test, have been exposed to anticoagulants, at least at some level. And a huge percent of it have been exposed to multiple compounds. So here it shows the number of compounds. And you can see a huge number of animals have been exposed to 2, 3, even 4 compounds. And the reason that is significant, the number of compounds, is because these anticoagulants are only used in a single compound formula. And so if you're finding multiple compounds in them, you know they've been exposed to them multiple times at the least. And so here I have an index of exposure. So this index of exposure takes into account how many compounds an animal has been exposed to and what levels we're finding it in the liver. And that kind of gives us a sense of how much exposure that animal has had to anticoagulants. It's not a super easy thing to determine. And then you can see the animals in green here. These are ones that had no mange disease, and there's kind of exposure, no real pattern exposure across the board, different levels. Whereas you look at the animals that have died with mange, you can see once they start getting to these higher levels of exposure, this is when we start seeing animals die of mange. And so there's definitely a correlation between being exposed to anticoagulants and dying of mange disease. So if we look back at our scat graph here, with these scat numbers that went way down in 2003, 2004, you can see that it correlates with when we started also seeing a large number of mange deaths. And so basically what we've seen is the population come down to a much lower level since mange has been prevalent in the population. They still do persist in the area, but the population has not really rebounded to the numbers that it was at prior to seeing the mange epizootic. And then, as I mentioned, the other leading cause of death is road mortality or being struck by a vehicle. Again, if we look back at our map, we know we have all these large secondary roads going around, all these nice natural patches of habitat. And most of these fragments aren't really large enough to support a whole home range, especially of a male. Sometimes we will see a female just use one of these patches, but the males in particular need to have several of these patches put together in order to make a home range. And so they're crossing these roads, and sometimes often. Sometimes we have animals that will cross these roads regularly, several times a week. And they'll do it successfully for a long time. And then unfortunately, eventually they get hit on them. And we also, have the 101, and I'm sure most everyone here is aware of the wildlife bridge that we're trying to put in here, which is going to be great for connectivity. We don't actually see a lot of mortality on the 101. It's just so much of a barrier. Animals don't even attempt to cross it generally. So it's not a big source of mortality, but it certainly is a barrier to movement. So that'll be exciting to have that. And then that's the other big challenge I wanted to mention for these animals in this area. As we all know, we are very fire prone and seem to be experiencing fire more and more often in the area. We have modern fire cycles in the area of 6 to 10 years, meaning a particular area on average will burn every 6 to 10 years. This is kind of a general history map of where we've had fire in recent years. And we know that the fire in itself can be a challenge to these animals. We haven't witnessed at least a lot of bobcats dying directly from the fire. We have seen some effects afterwards. We've seen animal die of burnt paws, meaning they went back into the burnt area too soon. But we know for sure that these areas, the habitat is not good after the fire. This is just an example. I wish I had a pre-photo of this exact area before, but this is a hill in the Rancho Simi area, if you're familiar with it. This used to be completely covered with coastal sage scrub. And this is right after the fire when it's just completely gone. There's nothing left. It's basically moonscape. And so as you might imagine, that doesn't make a very good landscape for a bobcat to live in anymore. This is a year after, so it is starting to come back, but it still has a long ways to go. And it's, we're again another year after now. It's looking even better, but still not the same as it was. So I wanted to kind of wind up here on a much happier note than the death and destruction of of the population. So one of the final things that we get to spend our time doing is some outreach and education with all sorts of folks, including yourselves. And we also do these festivals where we get to talk to little kids, and sometimes we'll have some of our we had one of our interns here doing some face painting, which is always a big hit. And we made little collars for the kids to wear. So just a little entertainment for them, and hopefully a little education about their local wildlife. And then just one last thing, one of my favorite parts about working with the interns is sometimes they draw funny pictures of you and the animals that you work with. So with that, I can take any questions that we've had in the chat.
Great. So Joanne, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And thanks everyone for pushing all of your questions in the chat. We've got quite a few. So I'm going to start with one here. How long do the collars last, and do they wear them forever?
That's an excellent question. So it really is dependent on the schedule that we put on the collars. We can put a very intense schedule on and then they won't last very long, potentially only 6 months, or we can put a much less intense schedule where we're not getting very much points and we can try to get a couple years out of them. We've kind of been experiencing some growing pains with the bobcat collars. They're at that smaller end where they can really utilize the GPS technology. And so we've been going from collar company to collar company to find the perfect match for these species. So sometimes these collars do have a built-in mechanical drop-off that will drop off the animal when it's exhausted the battery life. Unfortunately, some of the manufacturers haven't figured out how to make that type of a mechanism for a small enough collar for a bobcat. And so in that case, we add what we call a rot off on the collar. And so it's essentially just a piece of material that eventually decays and will rot and allow the collar to eventually fall off the animal. In that case, we do attempt often to just recapture these animals and replace their collar or remove their collar, but once they've been captured, they can be a lot more challenging to capture a second time. They become quite wise to the traps.
Great, thanks. It was good to see the photos of the dens and how you go about doing the trapping. Can you tell us what kind of bait is used to encourage them to go inside the trap?
Yeah, so we do use a variety of things. I think I had a photo. Let me find that slide again with the cat. This is one of the things that always kind of amazes me. Let's see. So this is a stuffed rabbit right here. And that's what was used for the bait. Are you guys seeing that?
No, we're not, but I think someone mentioned that.
Oh, okay, there.
Oh yes, I see.
So yeah, there's a stuffed rabbit. And so this is literally just a stuffed animal, but they're realistic looking. I was super excited when I found this because I had been looking for a realistic stuffed animal rabbit for a long time. And I finally found one. And, you know, you imagine these guys hunt in the dark, so they're pretty much just seeing an outline. And so they look in and they see this stuffed animal and it looks like a live rabbit and they go for it. So that's one of the things. We do use other things, including some roadkill and just deer meat, things like that.
Fantastic. So do the mums reuse their dens year after year?
No, they generally don't. We have seen that, I think on 2 separate occasions where a female did use the same den, but that is definitely not the norm. They typically choose a brand new den site every year.
Okay. And then another question, do the bright yellow ear tags on the kittens alert predators?
That's a good question. We've tried different colors trying to decide if we think there is any, you know, negative effect to the ear tags. I don't feel like there is, just from my own experience trying to view these animals in the brush. The ear tags definitely don't make them stand out. We often can't even see the ear tags or tell if the animal is ear tagged. But unfortunately, there's no real good way to study this on whether it is having any real effect. But it is certainly something that myself and other ecologists we're always thinking about things like that and trying to make sure we reduce any effect whatsoever.
Okay. Have you found that rabbit numbers are declining due to the RHD virus coming into California?
We haven't seen RHD yet in our population. We're kind of bracing for it. We don't know what kind of population level effect it's going to have. It certainly seems to be having a population effect elsewhere. So I would say not yet, but it might.
And then do the bobcats have a preference for one type of rabbit or another? Are they desert cottontails or brush rabbits?
Unfortunately, in the scat, we can't identify between the two, so we don't know through that. Just from the photos that we've gotten of the rabbits or of the bobcats hunting, they seem to have both types of rabbits, so it doesn't appear so.
Okay. And then a question about the rodenticide. Do you think there's anything that's causing an increase in bobcats' exposure to poisons?
I do think that the fire might have had an effect on that, just because it did push the cats. It seemed to have pushed the ones we were following more into the urban areas. So they're using the urban areas even more. I don't know if in conjunction with that, also, it might have been pushing the small mammals into the urban areas more and than having people use the rodenticides even more. So it might have been a compounded effect, but that would be the biggest thing that I've seen is just the fire pushing them to using those areas more.
And another one about poison. Are there any non-lethal anticoagulant problems you're seeing beyond mange? And are you testing the blood for anticoagulants? You are testing it for anticoagulants.
We have tested the blood for anticoagulants. Unfortunately, they're extremely hard to detect in the blood. They don't actually circulate for very long. So unless you are happening to catch that animal and take a blood sample shortly after exposure, you're not going to see the anticoagulants in the blood. So typically the only way we're detecting them is in the liver, and that's something that can only be done post-mortem, so after they die. So we don't really actually have a good way of testing the animals while they're still alive. We've tried various things. We've also tested clotting times and run some other types of tests to try to test for just mild like coagulation issues. And we haven't been very successful. It doesn't seem to be a good way to detect the anticoagulants, unfortunately.
Okay. And then a couple about fire, which obviously has impacted wildlife so much. Has the Woolsey fire changed the bobcats' behavior at all?
I think it certainly did change it right after the fire. Unfortunately, all of the animals that we were tracking prior to the fire died that same year after the fire. So we're not tracking any animals that we were also tracking before the fire currently. As I mentioned, they started using the urban areas more. And so we didn't have any of the animals die directly from the fire, but we had 2 die from mange and 2 die from getting hit by cars, and then 1 died from an unknown cause. And so I think all of those animals potentially were put more at risk because they did change their behavior after the fire.
And then about the burned areas, how long do you think it is before burned areas can support bobcats again?
That's an excellent question. It's kind of hard to answer. I think, it probably has a little to do with how much rain we get over the next couple of years and how quickly the habitat rebounds. So we have been, trapping in these same areas. So last year we saw almost no activity on our cameras around our traps and at our traps. And it was a little bit better this year. We saw a little bit more activity, but I still don't feel like it's normal. So I feel like by next year, it's going to improve quite a bit, but it'll probably, I would say, be a good maybe 10 years before it's going to be more like it was.
And then just one final question, unless anyone else has got any that they want to ask, you can put your hand up or just write something in the chat. Yes, so one more. Are you going out every month with the traps?
So we have a trapping season in fall and winter. So we'll trap for 3 or 4 months at a time. So we're trapping pretty much every single day, which means I'm on call 24/7 every single day for months on end. And then we'll close them for spring and summer. We close them in spring because we don't want to catch females that have kittens that they need to be taken care of. So we don't want to keep them away from their kittens. And then we don't trap during summer generally just because of the heat.
Got it. And then do you accept citizen volunteers for help with reviewing photos?
For reviewing photos, yes, we definitely do potentially. We're kind of exploring some options where to put the photos. So there's a site called Zooniverse, So you can look that up and you can actually help out on any number of projects. So any wildlife project can put their photos up on Zooniverse, and the general public can get on there, and I think you have to log on and make an account, and then you just get on and tag photos for people. And so we've explored options of putting our photos. We did put a couple projects up there. I don't think we have any currently on there, but we may be putting more photos up on Zooniverse to have people tagging them.
Okay, and I think one more question. Do you know, I'm sure you do know, do bobcats attack dogs?
Mostly I would say no, it's not impossible. They pretty much are going to stay away. They know not to mess with something that they could potentially get injured from. Maybe a particularly small dog running around by itself without the owner, I would be a little concerned, but it would have to be a pretty little dog.
And then one more is, do mountain lions attack bobcats? And that also links into another question, is how vulnerable are the kittens to predators, and which animals are the predators?
Well, so we did finally, so we do study the mountain lions, I'm sure most people know. So we've been following mountain lions for a long time, and we actually go into their kill sites and see what they're eating. And it was about a year ago, maybe now, that we did document the first bobcat at a kill site, but that's over going to hundreds and hundreds of kills, and it's mostly always deer. And we finally did document a bobcat. So it can happen, it does happen, but I would say it's not very common. It's not generally one of their predators. The biggest animal, I think, adult bobcats need to avoid or worry about in our environment, at least, is the coyotes. Sometimes coyotes can kill adult bobcats, although typically it's the young ones, the juveniles and the kittens that have to worry about the coyotes even more. And that's the biggest thing we've seen, other than mange disease, anticoagulants. The biggest issue we've seen for the kittens is if the coyotes find the den, they'll kill all of the kittens.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I think that's probably, I think that's all the questions that we've got at the moment. So thank you very much indeed, Joanne. And thanks you everyone for joining us this evening. Just a quick announcement. The next members event will be welcoming Beth Pratt, who's going to join us on April the 6th at 4 p.m. And she is going to be talking all about the wildlife crossing and what the latest, where we are at the moment. So we'll really look forward to that, and we'll be sending out notices about all of that as well as in the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much indeed. So hope to see you again next time. All right, bye everyone.